The 19th package of sanctions against Russia was supposed to be signed this week. It was already put together going after banks and other institutions, and it was going to be signed, I actually believe, tomorrow, September 17th. But it is now delayed and postponed to an undefined date after Donald Trump over the weekend made a few major requests to NATO and European countries. If you don't know, by the way, full context here, I was away for the past week, so I'm now slowly catching up on the news, but this news is now getting larger to the point to where we're trying to figure out what is the actual best way to put more pressure onto Putin. And what Donald Trump is suggesting here, I don't think it's that, and I have my own suggestion. So let's dive into what happened over the weekend. Donald Trump took to Truth Social to announce that he is ready to go and be tougher on Russia with tougher sanctions. You see, the United States right now in our Congress, we actually have two different bills. The biggest one being in the Senate, which would be a 500% tariff/secondary sanction on people buying things from Russia and sanctions onto Russia. And that is something we've been trying to get passed for months on end. I've been speaking to senators about it. We have about 90 senators who are ready to go, but they're waiting on Donald Trump, who in real time is watching Vladimir Putin kind of spit in his face. And we're actually watching him realize that Putin's not his friend. This war that it was going to be ending in 24 hours of him taking office, he's realizing that relationship he has with Putin has been a lie this entire time, up until the point to where he was purposely misled to meet with him inside of Alaska. And so Donald Trump this past weekend took to Truth Social to say that he's ready to do these tougher sanctions, but there are a lot of catches, and these catches are massive, and it's something that I don't think Europe would be able to do. Those two, just quite simply, is stop buying Russian oil, which, as you know, gets washed in countries like India and other things like that before being shipped out. And then the other one is, we need you to put a 50% to 100% tariff onto China, in which you know how much the United States economy relies on China. Well, I would say that Europe relies even more, making both of those options almost impossible, especially in today's climate. And so I just want to break this down for a second here, because when it comes to the EU and the Russian oil, there's been a lot of confusion. Yes, publicly, all of these countries have stopped buying Russian oil. But realistically speaking, they're still buying Russian oil. As I've been speaking to senators and things like that, and we're going to use Germany as a good key point here because of all the connections they had. It was almost virtually impossible for Germany to cut themselves off from Russian fuel because they had no other system in place. There is no other system in place. And even if it's now going into the 3.5 years into this, it takes a decade to build up infrastructure in which countries don't have to rely on Russia for their fuel. And even though you look at other countries right now in which, yes, they're arguing that Russian oil should still be going there, everyone stopped all this stuff so that way Russia doesn't make as much money. But they brought it down to a level to where it's, if we cut any more, we're unable to provide certain services to our people. So we look to see what has been happening inside of Europe. So back in 2021, the bloc depended on Russian oil for nearly half of its gas and over a quarter of its oil. Okay, half. They've brought that down to just 19% for gas and 3% for oil. That is big, okay? They were able to remove the majority of their dependency on this Russian gas and oil to a very small number. But to remove it completely is very hard. And even though they're doing everything they can, it really truly depends on how much those countries have tried to do this. And I say this because, there are some countries that have done their best to do it. There's other countries that have done things to purposely make it harder. And yes, we are talking about Hungary and Slovakia, who both countries rely heavily on Russian crude oil flowing through pipelines. And even though Ukraine had honored those different contracts with Russia to allow countries to get that at the beginning of the year, they stopped a lot of that stuff. And I mean, we're going to look at Slovakia, where they're still nearly 100% dependent on Russian oil, which means that they never even tried. They were doing everything possible to make it the worst and the hardest on their own people to create said problem, which is why you're always hearing, whether Hungary and Slovakia go on, like, well, we can't stop the Russian oil. Our countries will fall apart if we don't do it. Yeah, because they never took the steps. And it's because of that the EU can never 100% be removed of the Russian oil, because some of these countries refuse to do this. And instead of maybe Donald Trump calling out those countries by name and saying, yo, you're doing this, he's looping everyone else together, which isn't really fair, because those countries are purposely making it impossible to be fully removed from the Russian oil. Now, granted, I will say that Hungary and Slovakia, sure, they're buying that stuff. It's not as much as you would say China and India, who was importing this stuff at a crazy record, mostly because it's cheap. If from a, say, government point of view, you say to yourself, well, Russia is capped at how much they could sell at a certain price. We could just buy this. Even if we buy it and sit on top of it, it will do wonders for us down the line, which is why Donald Trump now is moving towards, you guys need to target China and even some of that being India, because they're the ones who are ultimately funding Russia. And this is where things get a little bit interesting. You have to remember that India is buying all this oil, and they're sending some parts for things. And China is not only buying oil, but they're also selling weapons parts and chips and cameras and other things to Russia. And if you kind of look at how things are, you could make the argument saying, well, if you were to cut India and China out of this Russian equation, then, okay, Russia can't get the weapons, they can't get the chips, they can't get the parts, they can't make money, which means, yeah, they can end the war. But there are other simpler ways of going through this, because realistically speaking, the EU relies heavily on China for everything from fashion, electronics, even wine. And it gets to the point to where if the EU targets China and India with these tariffs, once again, tariffs are something that the consumer pays, okay, like here in the United States, that would kill their economies. And why would we want to do that when there are simpler ways of handling this? Sure, you could say sanctioning Russia is one thing. Yes, it doesn't really hurt anyone except for Russia. Tariffs on India and China, that's going to hurt European countries. But the easiest way, and you may agree or disagree with this, is just allow Ukraine to go after Russian oil. Think about this for a second here. While we are dealing with, oh, well, they're buying the oil. Oh, they're selling them the parts. If you go to the source, which is something that the Biden administration never really allowed, if you go to the source, then Russia's got nothing to sell, which means they can't make money, which means they can't buy parts. And the only people who truly get hurt if Ukraine just goes after the oil is Russia. And it would force them to have to end their war because they got nothing to offer any country. They're not making money. Inflation's going to go even higher. They're going to have a gas shortage, which they do have in rural areas inside of Russia, a major gas issue, and cars are lining up for hours on end to fill up, but it's not really hitting like Moscow and St. Petersburg. It'll never hit that area. Russia will do everything in their power to make sure where the masses are, they get everything they need so that there is no unrest or freakouts or protests, even though protests never really truly happen in Russia because it's super illegal there. But if you truly think about this, allowing Ukraine to go after this stuff is better than sanctions. It's better than tariffs, because then Ukraine goes after, let's just say Ukraine takes out another oil, which they hit another one just this morning. Well, that's not going to hurt trade with China and the United States or trade with the EU. It's not going to hurt trade with India, because that's out of our control. Ukraine did what they needed to do. Do you see how this works here? But all of this leads into what is the best way to tackle this and put pressure onto Russia. And that ultimately comes down to a very unsimple answer. And that is, you need to do a little bit of everything. First, allow Ukraine to attack these oil refineries, because then you're cutting into Russia's oil revenue. Plus, you have the oil caps, or anything that is coming out isn't really making much money for Russia. You put embargoes in this stuff, service restrictions. That is one way, because they're unable to produce, then they're unable to sell. Then you go after people who are actually buying whatever's left over in secondary tariffs or sanctions. That's where you go to India. That's where you go to China. And you say to them, if you keep buying this stuff, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. So now you're hitting where it's being produced, how it's being sent out, and who is buying the thing. But then you got to hit people inside of Russia with sanctions. You're going after bank. You're going after SWIFT type measures. You're going after oligarchs. You're going after their frozen assets. So now you're hitting them on 3 different fronts: inside, outside, and then in the oligarch world. And then lastly, you give Ukraine military aid. You give them the opportunity to push out the Russians, to be able to strike deeper inside of Russia, to go after other targets that Russia may be using to continue its war. And when you hit things on the other end, and you add in maybe even a covert cyber operation, you get to a point to where you get to the last main thing, the last thing you hit Russia with, and that is diplomatic isolation and potentially just talks. Because if you get to the point to where you're stopping money coming in, you're stopping oil going out, you're stopping the partnerships that Russia has, you're creating a massive angry environment inside of Russia, going after oligarchs and frozen assets, and maybe you're doing cyber things and you're giving Ukraine more weapons, you're standing together and isolating Russia to the point to where they realize we now have no other choice but to actually stop our invasion of Ukraine. Like I said before, there is not just one thing that's going to stop things. It's going to be the combination of many things happening all at the same time, including even European countries depending less and less on Russian oil and gas. There's a lot that needs to go on here if we don't want to just give Ukraine all the weapons they need to end this war. And the question we still bring up is, are we going to have a major issue by not doing the sanctions and try to do what Trump wants us to do? Is that going to be an issue? But the one thing I want you to take in all of this is the fact that this delay kind of showcases the EU is slowing down what they're doing to coordinate with Washington. And Russia could look at this as though the EU is reacting to Trump and could feed a narrative in which the West is starting to divide. And that could be a problem. Because if Putin gets any hint that there's any division between the EU and Trump, they're going to use propaganda and other things to try to divide NATO and the EU when it comes to what's happening here. And we're already seeing this in Russia's push with the drones this past week, that they're making the blame on Ukraine. It's Ukraine's fault that these drones went into Poland, even though those drones would have never been there if Russia never invaded Ukraine. And there's no evidence at all that Ukraine has done anything to put those drones inside of Poland. But when you've got certain pro-Russian politicians in Europe spreading this fake propaganda like wildfire, it scares people, and it gets them to the point to where they don't know what's true and what's false, what's real and what's actual news. And it's the midst of that confusion that gets people into, let's just get this war ended. Who cares how it ends? We just need it to end. And you could see how the Russian propaganda starts working in people's mind. And that's where this whole thing happens. Because if for any second it looks like we're not together on this, then Russia is able to spread this stuff and scare people. And then we get to a point to where Russia eventually is being able to win on the propaganda side and get people to just quote unquote settle. And this could be a problem. But we'll see what happens this week. Donald Trump is going to be in the UK for a state visit. Very rare, by the way. The second time a president's ever, actually, I think it's the first time a president's ever been able to do a second state visit like this. Don't quote me on that. But let me know what you think about all of this in the comment section below. I'll be sure to keep you guys updated. As you can tell, I'm still trying to get back in the swing of things. I'm still a bit tired and out of it. But I'll be sure to keep you guys updated. So please do share my videos and follow me for more. Plus, remember, I still have my free Substack newsletter, which you can check out. I'll put a link to that in the description below. It is free. There is a paid version where you get your name at the end of my videos. So if you want to support what we're doing here, I would greatly appreciate it. But that being said, you guys stay safe, and I'll see you later.